Each and every year, the Canadian Whisky Awards is held in Victoria, British Columbia, Vancouver Island, celebrating the very best that Canadian whiskey has to offer. And this year, the award for Single Malt Whisky of the Year went to Victoria's own Macaloney's Island Distillery for their Peat Project Sugar Kelp Infused Portuguese red wine STR Barrique single cask peated single malt whiskey. And I have that on my table for the review today. My name is Matt. This is Whiskey on the West Coast. I, like so many other whiskey lovers, adore and really love the smell and taste of nice, smoky, heavily peated single malt whiskey. And that will typically mean that I'm looking towards Scotland or sometimes Ireland or even Japan for my peated single malt fix. However, one of the most exciting things about the Canadian whiskey scene over the last couple of years has been the emergence of Macaloney's Island Distillery as a leader in the field of Canadian peated single malt whiskey. And one of the reasons why I put them as a leader in that category isn't because other distilleries in Canada aren't doing heavily peated single malt whiskey. It's that they're doing it in an innovative way where they're using locally sourced peat as their source of peat for making the single malt, which very, very few distilleries are doing. In Canada, I can count a total of 3 that I'm aware of so far. So that's actually really fascinating. Now, why should the peat source matter? Well, where you source the peat from very much influences the aromas and the flavors that you'll get from your whiskey. An Islay peat source is typically going to be more coastal, more seaweed, iodine, medicinal notes, and a lot of like salinity, these sorts of things, because it's made of, say, decomposed seaweed and other such things, being close to the sea. In Orkney, they're famous for their floral heathery peat because there is a high percentage of heather in the composition of their peat. And then finally, if you're looking at the Highlands, oftentimes it's considered to be a more woody peat smoke because there is a higher concentration of wood that goes into making it, as opposed to the sphagnum moss and seaweed that you'll get on Islay. So where you source peat from absolutely matters, and it impacts the flavors of your whiskey. So if we're making peated whiskey in Canada, why would we not consider the source that we're pulling our peat from? And that's what's so exciting about these Macaloney's releases, not just because they're actually delicious whiskeys, and the Single Malt Whisky of the Year award attests to that, but because they are innovative and they're bringing us something that we haven't tried before, most likely. So when I'm looking at this whiskey right here, this is Washington Peat Project. So they used Washington peat sourced from Olympic Peninsula, just south of where Vancouver Island is, and actually just south of where I am. It's about 200-kilometer drive south from where I am in British Columbia, which honestly is not far. I'd have to drive much further to get to, say, my neighboring province in Alberta. That peat source was used by Westland Distillery for their Solemn release, and as well as Copperworks for some of their releases on top of that. But what Macaloney's has done with it is actually quite interesting, whereas Westland Solemn was only able to get, say, medium peated level for ppms. Macaloney's actually took that peat, and instead of sending it to a maltster like Westland did at Skagit Valley Maltings, they actually created their own kind of bespoke peat smoker to smoke the BC grown barley, locally sourced barley, to impart that peat. And they went to Islay to actually study this, and they got the phenols much higher. And so this is in fact a heavily peated, locally peated whiskey at 54 ppm. That is insanely high when you're thinking of, say, Lagavulin being around 35 ppm. Really impressive. But that's not where this whiskey stops with the kind of interesting nuances. They also infused sugar kelp seaweed into the mix. They harvested sugar kelp from the ocean because Vancouver Island, it's an island, it's surrounded by water. They actually sourced sugar kelp seaweed, and then they threw it on to the actual the peat smoker, is my understanding, and that infused the malt not only with the peat smoke but also the smoke from the sugar kelp. Really fascinating process. It just shows you one of the many ways that Macaloney's Island Distillery is innovating in the Canadian whiskey scene. Macaloney's hasn't only been rewarded for this innovation with this Single Malt Whisky of the Year award at the 2025 Canadian Whisky Awards, but they also won 3 other big awards, including Canadian Whisky of the Year, the big prize, the biggest of them all when we're coming to Canadian Whisky Awards. And that was for their Peat Project European Moscatel Barrique. And you're probably picking up a theme here. They're really getting noticed for their work with peated single malt whiskey. I think it's fantastic. I love that they're getting recognized for it, and it's very well earned for doing something so outside the box for Canadian whiskey. So well done, guys, and keep up the great work. This particular individual bottle here, it is a single cask single malt. So this is cask number 457 of their Peat Project Sugar Kelp Infused Portuguese STR red wine Barrique. What does that tell us there? That's telling us that, number one, they have used sugar kelp in the process, as we talked about earlier. It's 54 ppm. The red wine Barrique. Barrique is the size of the cask. STR is indicating it's shaved, toasted, and recharred, kind of like rejuvenated cask that once held Portuguese red wine, something that is kind of part of the house style at Macaloney's in my mind, because they do it quite often. They use that cask type quite regularly. Bottled at 46% ABV, it's non-chill filtered, it's natural color. It's almost as if Macaloney's is doing absolutely everything right. One more thing I have to mention to you guys here. I have actually been asked in the past to help out Macaloney's at some whiskey festivals around British Columbia, and as such, I cannot be completely unbiased here. I need you guys to be aware of that, because when I'm telling you my thoughts on this whiskey, you guys need to know that I may be a fan of this brand because I like the people that are behind it and they make good whiskey. So full disclosure, I have poured at festivals for Macaloney's in the recent past, about 3 or 4 times, and I've lent them a hand, and honestly, I've enjoyed every moment of it, because it just means I get to talk to more whiskey fans like you guys are. But yeah, full disclosure there. On to the review. My Victoria Whiskey Festival glass here. If you guys ever get a chance to go to Victoria Whiskey Festival, it's fantastic. It's a great time, guys. And maybe you can attend the Canadian Whisky Awards if you go a little early. On the nose, immediately, this particularly earthy, yet actually medicinal peat. Now, I will say I have experienced many different Peat Project releases from Macaloney's, and this one does come off a bit more medicinal, a bit more coastal than the others. And whether that is, subliminal messaging from knowing that there's sugar kelp, seaweed in this whiskey, I think it's there. I pick it up every time. So this coastal, slightly medicinal smoke, but it is earthy. It's just wrapped in this sweetness. Like fuzzy peaches, sweet and sour chicken. It's tart. The peat isn't overwhelming. You're picking up a lot of different fruit notes, a lot of candied notes, like vanilla and strawberries, but more on the candy tones. So like a strawberry Campino hard candy. A coastal seaweed. There's a bit of like a tartness here too, that's pointing maybe to that like Portuguese red wine element. Oh, a bit of leather there now as well. Peat, red wine. I oftentimes get like a sweet and savory barbecue sauce element too. But yeah, lots of candied notes, those fuzzy peaches, the strawberry Campino I already mentioned, and with that tartness, I'd even go as far as to say like sour keys candies. This peat smoke is lovely though. Yeah, really enjoying this. I can see why this nose would have been popular with the judges. Which, if we're talking about the judges, they get sent out samples. It's entirely blind. I think they score it and then they send it back. So they're actually running the awards pretty well when all considered when it comes to awards. Maybe some fresh raspberry in there too. Smoked raspberry. All right, to the palate. Slunge, guys. touch medicinal right off the top. That peat smoke gets in there. Earthy, some I wouldn't say like billowing peat smoke. Like it's not as heavy as you'd imagine for 54 ppm. It definitely comes off softer than that level for me. But maybe it's been rounded off a bit by the red wine cask. I know sherry cask, PX, red wine casks oftentimes round off the kind of more jagged edges of the peated whiskeys. I could see that happening here because this is really just super approachable. It's a sweet peat smoke. There's raisin on the palate. I'd say almost like a fig jam too. Honey, orange, milk chocolate, apricot, and like fruit leathers, like candied fruits. So yeah, maybe candied apricots or mango. That orange is almost like an orange spread, so like an orange marmalade. There's also something a bit like herbal in there too, almost like a fennel seed, or like, yeah, I'd go fennel. It's not quite like licorice for me. There's some pepper too, it's like some spicing, and I'd almost actually go more like nutmeg. Like it's a baking spice, less chili pepper and more on the baking spices. All right, another sip. Oh, on that palate, you're getting leather and tobacco on it as well. And that note in particular carries right through the finish. And the finish on this is actually quite lengthy. The viscosity on the palate is quite good. One of the big benefits of non-chill filtration whiskeys, and bottled a bit higher at that 46% strength. Yeah, that leather tobacco and sweet smoke is just really, that's speaking my love language right there. I'm loving this. And it's incredible for me to be drinking this as a Canadian whiskey using a North American locally sourced peat source. Like I cannot stress enough how close to the distillery this peat has been extracted from. I mean, again, within 200 kilometers in Canada is extremely local. That's hyper local. I would drive way further than that in a day. Even sometimes at work. Yeah, this is incredible stuff. It's a real achievement, and I am a big fan. Ooh, interrupting that thought. Have you ever had Captain Blacks? I've talked about the sweets, cigarillos in the past before that I smoked in high school. Oops. But they also had these like rum and wine versions as well. I'm picking up that note on the finish right now, the rum and wine Captain Blacks. That takes me back. Wow. Okay. There have been a number of editions of these Macaloney's Peat Project releases using a number of different cask types, and some of them having this inclusion of the Sugar Kelp infusion. This is absolutely one of my favorites of the whole line. I've tried quite a few. The Pedro Jimenez, the PX cask, is phenomenal. As is this STR seaweed infused, the Sugar Kelp infused. The European Moscatel Barrique is the Peat Project that actually won Canadian Whisky of the Year. So it goes without saying that is a phenomenal whiskey. However, I am actually a fan of that one at a higher strength. I think the 46% version of that lags behind some of these other releases. But there's one other cask type that actually I think I am enjoying even more from these Peat Project releases that I want to review for you as we go along, because it's a more recent release from Macaloney's. All this to say, I think you're in pretty safe territory if you're looking to purchase a Macaloney's Peat Project release. If you're in Canada right now, there's this focus on buying Canadian because of all that's going on in the world. And I am absolutely all about that right now as well, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure to cover a Canadian whiskey fairly soon. And so why not start with the single malt Canadian Whisky of the Year, seeing as I love single malts so much. You can pick this up from many different stores in Alberta. You can pick it up in British Columbia, but you can also order it directly from the distillery when it is in stock. I believe it is out of stock, so look towards the private stores for this one if you're in Canada. If you're abroad, I do know Macaloney's is selling abroad in some countries, and I know that they've actually finally landed in the United Kingdom as well. So check in with the stockists if you're in the UK, if you're wanting to pick this up, and see if they're actually importing this whiskey. As for score on this, it's tough to score because it's unlike anything else I've had in Canadian whiskey. And for that reason, I want to score it very high. Also, I really enjoy this and I'm just tearing through this bottle. However, it is still approximately 3.5, 4-year-old single malt whiskey. And that does place some limits on just how high it can score. But taking into consideration innovation, its unique place in Canadian whiskey, the really unique inclusion of sugar kelp infusion, man, I gotta give this like an 88 out of 100, which is an absolutely insanely impressive score for such a young whiskey from a distillery that really is still in it's in its first decade of making whiskey. I am so excited to see where this line goes. For me, I thought Macaloney's was going to be known for their triple distilled, pot still Irish style whiskey, or maybe perhaps for their whiskeys that really rely on heavy cask influences, like their Portuguese red wine Barriques. Honestly, I think Macaloney's is going to be known for their Peat Project releases, and one of the true examples of North American peated single malt whiskey. Fantastic stuff. I can't say enough good things about this whiskey. Well, that's it, guys. I hope you found this interesting, even if you cannot get this whiskey in your area. Thank you so much for watching, for supporting the channel, my Patreon members, for supporting me monetarily. It absolutely makes this channel run. For those of you who are commenting in the comment section, thank you so much. I always endeavor to answer as many of those as I possibly can. And for those of you new to the channel, like, share, and subscribe. I really appreciate anyone who's clicked on this video to watch it. And until next time, from the west coast of Canada, I raise this glass up to you. Slàinte.